Hi, and welcome to the Becoming Trauma-Informed podcast, where we help you understand how your past painful experiences are affecting your current reality and how you can shift those so you can create your desired future. I'm Dr. Lee, and both myself and our team at the Institute for Trauma and Psychological Safety are excited to support you on your journey. We talk about all the things on this podcast. No topic gets left uncovered. So, extending a content warning to you before we get started. If you notice yourself getting activated while listening, invitation to take care of yourself and to pause, skip ahead a bit, or just check out another episode. Let's dive in. Hi, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of Becoming Trauma Informed. I am really excited for today because I have another just incredible guest here. Also, I just want to brag and celebrate her a bit because this is her podcast debut. We love having brand new podcast humans on our podcast. It's such a fun thing to be able to do. So Dr. Carron Silva is here with us today. I'm going to invite Carron to tell us a little bit more about her. And I need to tell y'all just a bit about Carron and about how Carron and I met. Then we're going to ask her all the questions because her story is so incredible. And I think there's so much to be gleaned from it, from a trauma-informed perspective, from a psychological safety perspective. So Dr. Carron is a Catholic mindset coach and forgiveness guide. She really helps people feel safe. I'm reading over all the things she does. And what I'm hearing is that there's a lot of forgiveness and there's creating space to vulnerably get curious about what you believe and the things that have prevented us from becoming who God created us to be. And so I love that you write that you teach forgiveness as a life skill because it's such a yes, right?
Yeah.
And you're also a published author of a devotional memoir. Yes.
Yes. It's a daily devotional, but it's also a memoir.
Wow. Okay. Very cool. And you are an empty nester, a wife of 30 plus years, and you have adult kiddos. Yes.
Yes.
So you joined and have participated in a few of our programs. And one of the things that I was just absolutely riveted when I heard you talk about it was your journey around your immigration to the United States and what happened before you immigrated to the United States from South Africa and what happened after. And a lot of the trials and the traumas and the things that you went through and your level of resilience. So that is what I know the audience is going to get to hear from you today. And those are some of the things that I really want to bring out because I think that there's self-reflection in listening to you talk. And I remember one of the first things that I shared with you was that, I'm biracial, and as a white and Black and Indigenous human, so multiracial, when my husband and I don't know, about a year ago, we're having a conversation. I was telling him that I had hired or, started collaborating with a human from South Africa. And he said, oh, he saw a picture. He said, is she Black or does she identify as Black or colored? And I got so offended. I was like, what? I was like, you can't call people that. He's like, no, this is my white husband, by the way. He said, no, my love, in South Africa, that is a ethnic distinction is white, colored, or Black. And I was like, what? And I remember telling you that story and you gave me a lot of really good education on that. So I just wanted to even bring that to the audience because there's probably a lot of people out there like me in America that did not even know that was a thing. And so I'd love to just maybe start with that piece of your story around growing up in South Africa and the shifts and the experiences that you went through there before we get to even you stepping foot in the United States.
Yes. So I was actually born in 1966 and in November of 1966. So if you look at US history of the liberation of people of color in the US, your journey forward really started in the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
Our journey backward started in 48 and then really progressing in the 60s.
Mm.
So I was born smack in the middle of that, of the regression of a society, basically. And to add some layers to that, I was born to two parents who had just not known each other very well, had gotten pregnant, and then weren't able to keep me because they were unemployed and they were living with family. And so I was given to my 67-year-old grandmother, who had already raised her own 14 children, a lot of that for many years as a single parent. And because of apartheid, had been forcibly removed from her home twice in the country. So before apartheid, she was married. They were multicultural, multiracial family. So my grandfather was a descendant of the Khoisan. So he had the typical peppercorn hair, high cheekbones, small stature. And he was actually a politician. He was a councilman. And my grandmother was white. She was mixed race, but very light-skinned, very German Irish. Beautiful woman, dark hair, light eyes, light skin. And they married, and I think he had a child by a previous spouse who had died. And then my grandmother also had a child. So they came together with each having a child. And then they had 12, well, I would say 11 children in addition. And then when one of the older kids had a child, she took that child in. So it wasn't unusual for that to happen, right? So eventually there were 14 children in the family. And then when her son died, she took in his children. So I was number 19. By the time I arrived, I was number 19. But at this point in time, the older kids have moved on. So we ended up on the Cape Flats in a so-called colored township, Bishop Lavistown. Very violent, very, very violent. In a little duplex, because the government, basically what they did is they built these ghettos and they forced remove people from where they lived. And so they had acreage, they had animals, they had really a beautiful life until the government came in with the Group Areas Act. And the Group Areas Act designated certain areas for whites only, coloreds only, Indians only. There's another distinction for you, Indians from India.
Okay, Indians
and
from India.
I'm part Indian.
Okay.
Indians from India, and then of course the tribal people, the African people, which under South African rule, those were the Blacks. So you had this gradation of skin color in the society. And they did that by legally by just passing laws. So you had the Land Act in 1913, which divided the land into reservations, like here in the United States, and they moved people from the city centers to the reservations. And we called them homelands back there, tribal homelands. And then they created a pass system. And from that pass system, they very carefully controlled who could live in the city. And the people who were moved to the city and who could live in the city, they were there simply to perform the tasks that the minority government did not want their people to perform. So they were the nannies, the gardeners, the bricklayers, the factory workers, the mine workers. And so you have inside the country this back and forth movement of people very, very carefully controlled with passports. So already you can see where that's going, right? We're breaking up the family. We're keeping people in poverty. We are making them less than human already. So this is already starting in 1913. And so when the National Party comes into power in 1948, they begin passing all these laws. And they do it with impunity. And so there's the Immorality Act, which makes you a crime.
Yes. The fact that
Like Trevor Noah said, right?
Right. Like the fact that an actual human can be illegal, like their existence can be illegal.
Yes. So that happened in my family. My aunt fell in love with a guy whose family was Portuguese. And so in my home, I have memories of my uncle coming to visit my aunt in the middle of the night and staying and then leaving very early in the morning to go back home. And, and us going other places where we knew that they could be together without being reported and they had 4 children and they got married on my 21st birthday when finally that law came off the books.
Sure.
Which is just beautiful, I thought. But it destroyed them. He became an alcoholic. She really struggled because she lived in the township and he lived in his white area. And so the kids didn't have that opportunity to have both parents in the home. But to just keep talking about my upbringing. So I was in this home with my grandmother, with my uncles, with my cousins, with my aunt. There were 8 of us in this tiny 2-bedroom duplex. We had running water, but we didn't have electricity. And it was built with cinder blocks and an asbestos roofing. And so in the winter, it was extremely cold. It's very rainy in the Cape in the winter. It wasn't unusual for people to like make fires outside in a tin can and burn it down to coals and then put the coals in like a little tin and bring those inside to heat the home. So people would die from carbon dioxide poisoning because they were trying to, just those factors that we never really consider.
Yeah.
How does racism actually, what does it look like in real life, right? So this is an entire society structured on the concept of race. Now, I always explain it this way. It started well before then. It started with the British in the 1700s, in the 1800s, and it was the British who actually persecuted these white people, who now 3 generations later have developed this identity because they were interned in concentration camps. Their women were raped by British soldiers. Their children were killed. And so they developed this really, really strong identity around who they are as a people. And that includes their supremacy as white people based on actually scripture.
This sounds really familiar. As an American, this sounds very, very familiar.
Yes. Because if you look at the roots of it, it comes out of Europe, right? And it goes all the way around the world. And they were pursued first. And so they developed this identity and they see what they coined as die zwart gevaar, which is the black peril. That if they allow for relationships between their daughters and Blacks, it's going to dilute this race, this identity that they fought so very, very hard to preserve. Does it make it right? Is there justice? No, but it's understandable.
I've had literal chills the entire time you've been talking. And one of the things that's just like, my mind is blown around this conversation, because what you're talking about in South Africa, we can see the same catalyst with a somewhat different outcome here. And then I'm thinking of Brazil too, because Brazil is a place that I studied in college, and Brazil took almost the exact opposite, where they said, oh, we're going to participate in eugenics and in the blanqueamiento, but we're going to wipe out the Black threat by having them couple up with and produce children with white humans, because then we can wipe them out. And it's just so fascinating how all of this colonization has led to different outcomes of how we're going to deal with the threat. And yet it's coming from this source of identity.
Fear.
And it's coming from fear of the other.
Yes, fear.
The other thing that just came up, and I'd love to just pull this out for our listeners too, because, we talk about adverse childhood experiences on this podcast, and about how we know that when kids are exposed to things within the home that are traumatizing, like what you just said, separation from parents.
Yeah, and there's a whole lot more.
Yeah, and also then community, right? Lack of access to resources, food instability, all of these pieces. And then on top of this, thinking about the entire country is going through some traumatic changes. And so I'm curious how as a child, like, I know a lot of times as kids we don't see it until we get older. What was noticeable to you as a child, and what only became noticeable once you grew up and looked back?
That's a really, really good question. I have this saying that it has to go somewhere. That's my saying. It has to go somewhere. So if you emasculate men and women, that frustration has to go somewhere. It goes to the children. That frustration in the children has to go somewhere. So if you're the oldest child, it's going to go down to the younger siblings.
Power.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So for myself, I happened to be in a home where the male adults went to alcohol. The female adults kept everything together. But there was a lot of violence so what I noticed growing up in my early childhood, what I experienced was extreme domestic violence. So stabbings, fights, furniture being broken, windows being broken. I wrote about it in my book. There's one entry called The House with the Broken Windows. That was my house. There's sexual abuse. So I was sexually abused by one of my uncles. I witnessed my own grandmother set fire to my uncle in my home. I was probably about 4 years old. I witnessed him stab my cousin. And so for me, looking back at that period of time, thank God I have had a lot of therapy, is a movie of violence upon violence. And that's just in the home. So now you pan out and you start seeing it in the community. You start seeing what's happening with police brutality. We happened to live on the very end of a very busy street, and there was a bus stop right by our house. And it was a very busy place where the police would always come by, like on Friday nights, because that's when people would get paid, and that's when they would get drunk, and that's when fights would break out and those kinds of things. And so it wasn't unusual to witness police van, what we call it police vans, but it would be like a truck here, like a pickup truck, would come by, and they would just like jump out and start beating on people and arresting them, things like that you would notice like on a weekly basis. So just that level of violence, and then violence against women, just watching how, although my aunt was a very strong, very tall woman, and she was in her teens, late teens, early 20s. She had a child out of wedlock, my cousin, and she was kind of the ruler of the roost, I would have to say. And she would keep order. And when she was there, she kind of kept my uncles in check. And so there was a lot of like back and forth in prison for them. My uncle, the one, remember in trauma, we need that one. So it was my uncle Isaac. His nickname was Sucky. He was really the one who was I wouldn't say my primary caregiver, but he was what we all call my drunk uncle. He was disabled. When I was just barely born, he and my other uncle were in a massive accident, and my other uncle died and he sustained a lot of injuries. And so he wasn't able to work, which was a blessing for me because uncle would get me up in the mornings. He would bathe me. He would braid my hair. He taught me to read. I could read by the time I was 4.
Mm-hmm.
He would sit
What a
me on his
blessing.
lap. He would sit me on his lap and he would tell me stories when he was sober. Uh, we listened to the radio together in the evenings. You know, I could sing pretty much every Barbara Streisand song there was out at the time. You know, I was a huge Barbara Streisand fan when I was like 6 years old. But he opened up that world for me. So that one adult, you know, that was just there. Who was I connected with him on that level, right? He did things like, you know, reaching in between my legs and going, ew, things like that, which is sexual abuse, right?
Yeah.
I look back on that and I don't feel violated in the way that you would feel violated by someone who's using you.
Yeah.
In my brain, that was just uncle playing a game.
Yeah.
Because we had that relationship. It's I don't know what you would call it psychologically, but that was uncle. And here's the very interesting fact that I want to point out. Uncle had dreams for me, and he used to call me Dr. Carron.
Oh.
So that's kind of the microcosm of the family. Now go out into the community and into what's happening in the country. And so there are these periods when my uncles and aunts and cousins they're at home because they're on strike.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, it's just like, oh, they're home. And that's actually when it was not good for me.
Yeah.
Right? So it was good for me when they all went off to work in the shoe factory or wherever they were working. It was when they were home and drinking that it became unsafe. So those were the periods of time that I think that was not good for me growing up. When I started school my first year, I was 6 when I started school. They enrolled me in an English medium school, English Afrikaans medium school, so bilingual school. And then I think what happened was, you know, more and more and more, my trauma was manifesting itself, although I didn't understand what was happening.
Sure.
And I think my uncle's behavior escalated more and more, and the violence got to be so to the point where I think I'm making these assumptions that it was my parents realized that it was time to bring me home. In the meantime, they had 2 more children and they got themselves out of homelessness and into a home that they shared with 2 other families. So they got 2 rooms in a home with 2 other families. And so they were able to stabilize. And then one day they just showed up and said, "You're coming home." They packed up my stuff and zipped me off home.
How did that feel?
I cried. I had nightmares. I had night terrors. I cried for weeks. So it's just that lack of understanding of what trauma was at the time. And they're all surviving, right? They're all surviving. We're all surviving. So it wasn't really until I was living with my parents in another town in the country, in the heart of the wine country, actually, of South Africa. Age 8, 9, 10, my mom worked at the same shoe factory as her siblings. My dad worked in the leather industry locally. So my mom had to travel by train every day for an hour there and an hour back. And so she left early in the morning. My dad left a little bit later, but I became the responsibility for my siblings. So I basically started watching over them from age 9 or so. My aunt was supposed to be our caregiver, but for the most part, we just kind of ran loose. There was about 30 of us in the neighborhood. We all just hung out together. But it wasn't really until then that I started noticing the effects of apartheid, mostly on how my mom would be on strike and people would be talking about boycotts and strikes. And when I was 11 years old, Steve Biko was murdered. And I think about George Floyd's murder sort of as that turning point for me, beginning to understand really what was going on. I mean, you kind of knew you weren't supposed to enter in this entrance because that wasn't for you. You're not supposed to go walk on this street because if you walk on this street, there are some white people who can hurt you.
Yeah.
You know, and so you grow up with this understanding, this hidden knowledge of places not to go, places to go, where you're allowed to go, where you're not allowed to go, which part of the train you can sit in and which part of the train you can't sit in. It becomes the norm.
Mm.
So after a while, that's just how you live. You know, it's not something that's sort of in the back of your mind every day. Like it's because it's just life. It's just how you live your life.
It's the water you swim in, right?
Correct. You wonder in the Cape Colored, and I'm going to say Cape Colored because under government classification, all the people of mixed race, the so-called coloreds who lived in the Cape were designated on our ID documents as Cape Coloreds. So they had a distinction between Cape Coloreds and other coloreds. And there was a joke about that.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of jokes, actually. So the way we dealt with things was through humor.
Absolutely.
Dark humor.
If you don't laugh, you cry, and you can't cry. So let's laugh. Yes.
So in my teens, when I started high school was really my very, very first encounter with the resistance. My first, 3 months in high school was when I really first was introduced to the struggle. And we called it the struggle. And what happened there was the students called a boycott, meaning we're not going to school.
Yeah.
Or we go to school, but we don't go to class. When we are at school, we have protest action. And so 1980, freshmen in high school, just, about mid-year, they called us a boycott. And what happened there was we would have mass protest meetings. I have this singing voice, actually, and I would actually entertain everybody singing songs and stuff. But college students would come to our campus and they would educate us on our history, the people's history. And we would have mock trials and we would have discussions and just this beautiful intellectual revolution of questioning, but also equipping, right? Questioning and equipping and helping us to see that our identity wasn't what we were told who we were. That we had this rich history as a people and that our human rights were taken away from us. And so the ANC, the African National Congress, had drafted the Freedom Charter. And so we were taught those things in the Freedom Charter, And what always ended up happening was the South African Defense Force would be deployed into our neighborhoods and onto our schools. And what happened that year was one night we had interestingly enough, we had modular buildings that were in very bad shape that we had to go to school in, and the kids set them on fire. So they burned classrooms down to the ground. And then the next day was a battle. That's when the police showed up. We were all there on school grounds when they showed up in their military vehicles with their machine guns, with their full gear, full riot gear, with their tear gas, all of those things. And they came and they arrested all of the boys. They had these big trucks. They took them out of the classrooms and they just loaded them all up.
Just the boys.
Just the boys. They didn't do anything with the girls at that point.
Fascinating. Okay.
And they drove them down to the local jail.
Yeah.
And right after that, all the word spread really quickly. And there are factories very close to my high school. The workers found out what was happening, so they quit their job. They quit for the day and they started marching. And so you had this mass of people, all the girls from our school, people from the neighborhoods, people left their jobs and they marched on the police station. So my very first experience was, I can see it right now, literally standing like on this island in the road, chanting and screaming and demanding the release of our fellow students.
Yeah.
You're talking about 14-year-old to 18-year-old kids here.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point in time, right after that event, they did eventually release some, but there were 6 students who were arrested without trial. And they were in jail for a long time. And my mom actually, at that point in time, became a community activist. She arranged for fundraisers to raise money for legal fees, and we supported the families. These were kids I went to school with.
Yeah.
We knew their families, right?
Yeah.
And so that was kind of my foray into understanding, oh my gosh, we are in this epic battle for our freedom. The way I dealt with it was to dive into my studies. Very early on, I could see what education could do for me. And I actually have had a lot of guilt around this because I was so razor focused on my outcome that in many ways, I did not get involved really with the liberation struggle on a deeper level than a lot of my friends and my sister. My sister was deeply, deeply involved in the liberation struggle. My brother was later on a marshal in the ANC. So he was one of those people who would wear the armband and keep the peace. And myself, I kept the family together. We had a lot of problems in our family, And so for me, I was responsible for the family. I cooked the meals, I took care of the kids, and it was a lot of, I'm only getting 5 hours of sleep tonight because I'm studying for exams. I'm hand washing my family's clothes because there's no washer.
Yeah.
There's no electricity. I'm cooking on a gas burner or I'm making fire in the wood burning stove. And that's what I'm cooking on. So, so my focus was keep the family together, take care of the kids and get good grades and get your education so you can get out of here. And it's interesting because I finished high school and then that same thing that happened in my freshman year in high school happened in college because I chose to go to a colored college.
Okay.
I chose to go to the University of the Western Cape, otherwise known as Bush, because, behind every bush, there is a communist.
I'm like, oh, that one, that was a slow burn. I got it. Okay.
So, because, at the time, the government was stamping out communism, basically, right? And that was their reason for coming on our campus. And again, it's the same thing. They came on campus. We were barricaded behind, like we threw desks and whatever we could and, put it behind the door so that they couldn't come through and we were hiding. So my first 6 months of college was boycott. And so I did all of my studies really at home. Wow. And what was great was our professors put together packets for us so that we could still do our work because their message to us was, you're in a liberation struggle. And that means you show that you can still obtain this education.
Wow.
And so we actually, in the midst of all of that, we still took our exams and we still we did our work, but we weren't in class. Those 4 years of college were probably the most volatile years in the liberation struggle in South Africa.
And this is
1984 to
okay.
1988.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's when I really saw a lot of political violence and experienced that discrimination in person, like one-on-one, like being told, you can't be here on this side of the station, you need to go there. You can't sit here in this train, you need to go there. But that's when I really started participating more in the action. And I wasn't really engaged until my first year. I actually taught in a segregated school. I taught English, my second language. And there, what I did with the kids, same thing. The kids in that school called a boycott. And so I put together packets for my students, and I did home visits to make sure that they were doing their work. So I would walk the neighborhood and visit my students and make sure that they were doing their work. But I also started like a drama group, and we went around to community events and we would reenact some of the scenes that we had seen, that the kids had experienced. And again, the police came into, we put on The King and I.
Oh.
The kids would not go to school in the daytime, but in the evenings, we would do this huge production of The King and I in the building. And I played Anna in The King and I.
I love it.
And again, because of this mass action, the SADF, the South African Defense Force, the police, the riot police came into that township in Stellenbosch, Clutesville, Stellenbosch, and that place was lit up. And some of my students were shot with birdshot.
And how old are they?
So they're high schoolers.
Okay.
So the next day after that event, I had a friend who had a car, and I went and I heard who got shot. And so I went to their homes to see if they needed medical assistance, because you had to be careful which doctors you went to.
Sure. Because
oftentimes if you would show up at a doctor's office, the police would be there waiting.
Sure.
I would have to say that the South African police force had the best surveillance teams in the world during that period of time. I personally know that there are pictures of me, because that school boycott started in my classroom. Because the kids came to me the day before they walked out and said, Nike, we're heading out tomorrow. And so here's what I did in my English classroom. I taught the prescribed curriculum, but I also taught the people's literature. And I also taught my kids how to take care of themselves should they get shot, should they be hurt, should they be injured, where to go if they got injured. So we were taught how to teach our kids to take care of themselves in the event that the police would come and break up protests.
Okay. I want to pause here for a second. I think this is the quietest I've ever been on a podcast, honestly, because I think that I can see the layers of trauma here, the big T's and the little T's. And also, I want to draw a parallel for a lot of the humans living in America that listen to this podcast. I was having a conversation with a few moms yesterday about active shooter drills, and they were talking about just how awful it is that we have to have these in schools, because we just had an event, another event of this.
Yes.
And I am sitting here thinking, now two things are true, right? Yes, that is awful that we have to do those things. And I think sometimes we don't have the expanded view of, yes, and can you also imagine teaching your 14-year-olds how to take care of their gunshot wounds at home? Because we can't get them medical attention without the police being involved.
Yeah.
Like the waters you were swimming in, that you were trying to shift. I've been near tears this entire time, because I would say that what you've described to this point is, I see bits and pieces of where there wasn't trauma.
Yes. Yes.
And I'm curious, how do you go from a life of where there are only there are small pockets of not having big and little t traumas to the life that you're living today? That's a really big question.
Faith.
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 Please,
Faith.
Tell me more, please.
I was a member of the Old Apostolic Church growing up.
Yeah.
And my grandmother was a very, very devout believer in Jesus Christ.
Uh-huh.
And so she taught me early on, like when I was 4, like I said, I could read by the time I was 4, but I could also recite the Our Father, and I could recite Bible verses, and I could, and she was half crippled, but on a Sunday morning, we would get up, she would dress me up, and we would walk to church.
Mm-hmm.
And just being rooted in that in early childhood. And then my mother also, very, very, very strong believer, very strong faith, a lot of superstition, because in African culture, superstition is huge.
Sure.
And so they laid that foundation that really helped me have this belief that someday there will be justice. It may not be in my time, but someday. And so there's this hope. And if you look at what Bishop Desmond Tutu did in South Africa, for South Africa, he wasn't the only one. We had our own people in our communities with that same strong faith. And that faith gave us hope. Mm. And hope, as they say, springs eternal.
Yeah.
But that ability to, we had a common enemy. Mm-hmm. There was no choice but to persevere, to support each other. My husband always used to say, I don't understand you people. You do the worst things to each other, and then you just forgive and move on. And it's not like that in his experience.
Yeah.
There are people like in his family, they hold grudges like crazy. And I keep trying to explain to him, when you have an enemy like that, you cannot have enemies in your home.
Ooh. Okay. So will you say that again, please?
When you have enemies like that, you cannot have, and where would you go? You can't have enemies in your home all the time. There has to be a place where you feel safe, even if it's not the level of safety that you would define as psychological safe, right? Mm-hmm. Psychologically safe. Where would you go? We relied on each other.
Yeah.
We had to. I can't tell you how many times my mother would pack up bags and bags of food to take to relatives because they had nothing to eat. How many times we would have eggs and toast for dinner and tea, and how many times we had this saying, lang Pete is alweer in kas. Long Pete is sitting in the cabinet again, meaning the cabinets are empty, there's no food. Mm-hmm. And especially during those periods of long factory strikes, when the unions would call strikes and people couldn't go to work and they were not getting paid, but there was always something on the table. Mm. Always. We did not go hungry like some people. So in our family, we were very blessed in that my dad had so many connections with people on the farms. He had a sideline selling vegetables and fruits, and he was a hustler. I mean, he hustled for us. He always had something going on the side to make money. He had to drop out. He dropped out of school when he was 12 years old. My mom had to quit school at age 15 to help support her family. So their dreams were dashed, and they put everything into us as kids. Their methods were not the best. I can tell you right now, we experienced some pretty harsh physical, emotional, and mental abuse in our family. But I can look back now and see their fear. I couldn't see it then, but I can see it now. And, I teach forgiveness because forgiveness worked for us in our family. It worked in the country for a lot of the people. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was huge. And does it give justice? No, because forgiveness isn't justice.
What do you see as the difference between forgiveness and justice?
Justice means getting your just desserts. Forgiveness means giving up the right to get your just desserts and letting go of that bond that you have with someone that's not healthy, that's holding you prisoner.
And that is such, when we talk about the journey of recovery from trauma, the third stage, there's 3 stages, and the third stage is reconnection, reconciliation, justice, advocacy, all these pieces. And one of the things that I talk about with my clients when they're in that third stage is you can seek justice. And what is going to bring you regulation and closure is the fact that you sought it, not whether or not you get it.
Correct.
Because if we put the closure and the reconciliation into the hands of the legal system, the justice system, other humans, then we are likely to be disappointed.
Correct. And it brings back things that you don't want to relive.
Yeah. And one of the things we also talk about is that stage can only be fully realized when you've gone through the second stage, which is remembrance and mourning, which is feeling the full weight of what has happened.
Yes. Allowing for it to be.
Yeah.
It takes years. I mean, I've done every therapy there is under the sun, off and on over the last 30 years. And 30 years ago, therapeutic models hurt people.
Yeah.
I was told that I needed to go and confront my parents for leaving me in a home for almost 8 years where all that violence occurred and they didn't protect me. And so my husband and I, right after we got married, we went over there. I called the whole family together. We all sat around the table and I confronted my parents. And they started blaming each other because they didn't have the emotional capacity to deal with what they heard. But I can tell you, we ended up having conversations years later that were so fruitful and so beautiful. I reconciled with both my parents. Before my mother died, my mom died at age 56, very young. My husband keeps saying, your mom committed long suicide. She didn't take care of herself. She couldn't. I mean, if you look at my mom's story, her dad died when she was 9. That was right around the time they started passing all those laws. Yeah. And so by the time she was 15, had been forced removed from her home twice. And then being responsible for her younger siblings and having to get a job. If you look at her story, the mere fact that she raised 4 beautiful, successful, healthy young adults into an adulthood where the next generation doesn't look at all like her generation. That
Mhm.
is triumph over trauma.
Absolutely. Thank you for saying this. My sister, also a doctor, Dr. Lindsay Luther, she once drew this graph that I thought was really cool. And she said, sometimes we look back and we get so frustrated with our parents because they aren't at the place we're at. And the only reason that we're at the place we're at is because our parents did the work to get to where they are now.
Yes.
And I see all these these arcs that are just overlapping, but they're continually progressing toward, from survival to thriving.
Yes.
And I've shared in pockets of other podcast episodes just some of my family history, which I am 2 generations removed from the violence that
Yes.
my family experienced. And I can see how them going through that created a path forward for us to be where we are now.
Yes.
And so it's very much a both and, right? You're talking about this monumental trauma, this monumental abuse that's occurring within your home, and also recognizing that the humans who perpetuated that abuse were also doing the absolute best that they could.
Yes, I call it when love expresses itself in fear,
Mhm.
which then leads to that abuse because
Yeah.
the person doesn't have the skills to show love in any other way because they can see where they've been and they're so afraid that it's going to repeat. And so their methods are not the right methods, they're not the best methods, but they get results.
That.
And the results are not what we want, but they are the results. And we can choose what we do with those results.
Mhm.
I chose to get an education. I was the first one. I'm the oldest. And everybody followed in my footsteps. I played school a lot when I was a kid. I taught my siblings to read.
I love this.
So do you understand what I'm saying here? Is
Yeah.
that we have every step of the way, we have agency.
And that is one of the beautiful silver linings to everything you went through. What I can see is time and time again, you were given evidence of agency and how important that was. And honestly, I think this is part of the reason that at the Institute, we do the work that we do, is that a lot of humans don't have that evidence of agency. And so you talk about that one person that's like, hey, do you realize that yes, all these bad things are happening to you and they're not your fault. And you have the ability to respond
Yes.
intentionally to what is not your fault.
Yes.
And that's a thread that I see woven through at least this first part of I know it weaves through the second half because we've talked about that privately, but I can see that woven so much into the first part of your story. And what it seems weird to call that a gift in the horror of everything you went through, but also what a gift.
Yes.
So we have to have you back on because I know other people want to hear it too, but personally, I'm I need to hear the back half of this story, or not the back half, but the second half of this story shared. If you were able to just share one thing that you have pulled from this first part of your life, this time in South Africa with the audience, around these ideas of forgiveness and reconciliation, what is it that you want people to take away from your experience?
I talk about perspective in my retreat, my workshop. And I use this analogy. When we look at our circumstance through a microscope, what do doctors or researchers do when they're looking through a microscope? They're looking for faults. They're looking for the thing that's wrong. Mm-hmm. And they're really laser focused just on the thing that's wrong. And so when they're doing that, what are they missing all around them? But what if we decided to look on our situation through a kaleidoscope? Mm. Because you twist that thing, and what happens? You get new patterns every time, and they're beautiful. And so if you're only looking for what's wrong, you're missing all the goodness, the truth, and the beauty. Mm. So what I would really encourage people to do is, instead of focusing in, focus out. Expand, expand, expand. Go back, go back, go back. And look for truth, beauty, and goodness amidst all the bad. Mm. Because truth, beauty, and goodness can come out of the bad.
I don't think I'd be sitting here having this conversation with you were it not for the very horrible things that happened to me when I was younger.
Yes.
And just as like a response to that from personally is, I've had people actually ask me this before, if you could go back and change what happened to you, would you? And I say no. Mm-hmm. Because number one, I don't know what would have been the outcome if I did change it. And number two is like, the beauty that I have in my life now is a direct result of the agency that I declared over what happened to me.
Yes. Ditto.
Yes. I was going to ask you, do you feel the same? So, okay. Well, I think this might be the most, again, people who listen to me, they're like, Lee talked so little during this episode, which I absolutely love. Like, this might be my favorite episode, and they're all my favorites. And like, just the impact of this, I want to just deeply thank you, Dr. Carron, for coming on and being willing to be so vulnerable and sharing your story with us, because I know that this is going to profoundly affect every single human who listens to it. And we would love to have you back on. And if people want to connect with you further, they can get your devotional memoir, which is available. We can
on Amazon. Yeah.
On Amazon. So we'll make sure that we put the link to that in the show notes. And we have other ways for people to connect with you personally if they feel called to do so. So we'll put those also in the show notes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Seriously, thank you. This has been phenomenal. We're going to definitely have to get you on other podcasts.
I'm just so grateful for your organization. It's like, what a breath of fresh air.
Thank you.
For me to know that there is this work being done. Yeah. It's such important work.
I deeply appreciate that. Thank you so much. And okay, I'm going to go be speechless off camera. Thank you all so much for joining us. We will definitely have a part 2 to this, and we'll let you know when that's coming out. And I hope you all take care of yourselves and stay well, and we'll see you next week. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Invitation to head to our show notes to check out the offers and connections we mentioned. Or you can just head straight over to institutefortrauma.com and hop in our email list so that you never miss any of the cool things that we're doing over at the Institute. Invitation to be well and to take care of yourself this week, and we'll see you next time.